Welcome to Dead Air Confessions. Late at night, when the streets are empty and the signal begins to fade, people start sharing the things they never say out loud. The strange call they received, the person they saw standing outside, the night they realized they were not alone. Tonight, you will hear stories from people who carried those memories for years. Before we go on air, leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from tonight. And if you enjoy true scary stories with a quiet, late-night feel, subscribe to Dead Air Confessions. Turn the volume down low. The line is open. During my high school days, I used to take the bus home late at night because of extra tutoring. It became part of my routine for a while. I would leave school later than most people, usually after the normal day had already ended and the halls had emptied out. The extra classes were supposed to help me keep up, prepare for exams, and stay focused on my future. At the time, it felt important, even if it also meant I was often tired by the end of the night. By the time I got on the bus home, it was usually late. Not always exactly midnight, but close enough that the streets had changed. Shops were closed. Most people were already inside their homes. The traffic had died down, and the city or neighborhood felt quieter than it did during the day. I remember sitting on the bus with my bag beside me, exhausted from studying. Sometimes I would look out the window. Sometimes I would stare at nothing. Other times, I would go over things from class in my head, trying to remember formulas, notes, or answers for an upcoming test. The ride itself was not scary. It was just long and quiet. There were usually only a few people left on the bus at that hour. Some were workers heading home after late shifts. Some were students like me. Some looked like they had nowhere else to be. Everyone kept mostly to themselves. No one talked much. The fluorescent lights inside the bus gave everything a dull color. Outside the windows, streetlights slid past in long yellow streaks. Houses, parked cars, trees, and empty sidewalks came in and out of view as the bus moved through the night. Eventually, I would get off at my stop and walk the rest of the way home. My apartment building was not far from the bus stop, but at midnight, even a short walk could feel longer. The road was usually empty. I would hear my own footsteps, the occasional distant car, maybe a dog barking from behind a gate somewhere. Most windows in the nearby buildings were dark. At first, I never thought much about it. I was used to coming home late. Then I started seeing her. The first time, I noticed a woman standing near my apartment door. She was facing it, not looking casually in its direction, not waiting nearby while checking a phone, not sitting on the stairs or speaking to another person. She was standing there, staring at my door. At first, I assumed she had the wrong apartment. That seemed like the most normal explanation. Maybe she was looking for someone. Maybe she had come to visit a neighbor and was confused about the building. Maybe she was waiting for somebody to come home. Maybe she had lived there once and had some reason to be standing outside. I did not think much about it. I had been coming home late, and I was tired. I just wanted to get inside, eat something, take a shower, and sleep. As I got closer, she seemed to notice me. Then she walked away. That was it. She did not run. She did not say anything. She did not look at me in an obvious way. She simply turned and moved away from the door as I approached, disappearing into the darker part of the walkway or around the corner of the building. It was a little strange, but not enough to scare me. People do strange things at night. Maybe she had been embarrassed. Maybe she had thought I was someone else. Maybe she had been waiting for a tenant and realized she had the wrong place. I went inside and forgot about it. Then I saw her again. A few nights later, I got off the bus after tutoring and made the same walk toward my apartment. The streets were quiet. The air felt cooler than it had earlier in the evening. I remember feeling tired and annoyed with myself for having to wake up early after getting home so late. My mind was on school, not ghosts or strange women standing outside doors getting home. Then, as I came closer to my building, I saw someone near the entrance. It was her. She was standing in front of my apartment door again, staring at it, the exact same way as before. She did not look like someone waiting for a friend. She did not look like someone checking addresses. She looked completely focused on that door, as if nothing else existed. I slowed down. Something in me felt uneasy. When I was still several steps away, she turned. Then she walked away. Again, no words. Again, no explanation. Again, she disappeared before I had the chance to ask her what she was doing. That was when I started paying attention. The next time I came home late, I looked for her before I even reached the building. I hated that I did it, but I could not help it. Once you notice something strange repeating, your mind starts expecting it. You begin scanning the same place every time you arrive. The entrance, the doorway, the space near the stairs, the shadows beside the building. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Maybe I had only seen the same person twice because she lived nearby. Maybe she walked through that area every night. Maybe she had some connection to another apartment in the building. But then it happened again. There she was, standing at my door, facing it. Still silent the moment she saw me, she walked away. At first, I tried to understand who she might be. She did not look like someone I recognized from the building. I had seen many of the neighbors before. I knew the people who lived in the apartments around us, at least by sight. I knew who came and went. I knew which people had dogs, which families had children, and which tenants usually came home late from work. But I did not know her. She did not seem to carry a bag. She did not seem to be waiting for transportation. She did not knock. She never tried the door. She never spoke to anyone. She just stared. The more often I saw her, the stranger it became. This was not a one-time event. It happened repeatedly. Every time I returned home around midnight after tutoring, there was a chance she would be there. Sometimes I would see her from farther down the walkway. Sometimes she would be close enough that I could make out her posture and the way she stood. I do not remember every detail of her clothes. I do not remember whether she always wore the same color or if her hair looked exactly the same each time. But I remember the feeling she gave me. She looked sad, not aggressively threatening, not angry, not like someone trying to rob me or scare me. She looked like someone waiting for something that would never happen. That made it worse in a different way. If she had acted wild or violent, I might have known what to do. I would have avoided her, called someone, told the landlord, or gotten help from a neighbor. But she was quiet. She did not approach me. She did not chase me. She did not say my name. She just looked at the door, then left when I arrived. For 4 months, it kept happening. 4 months is a long time to see the same unexplained thing. At first, I would tell myself I was tired. Then I would tell myself I had misunderstood the situation. Then I would decide the woman must have been real, even if I did not understand why she was there. But after enough nights, I started dreading the walk home. I would get off the bus and feel my stomach tighten before I reached my apartment building. I would start wondering whether she would be there. Some nights, I would walk faster. Some nights, I would stay on the other side of the street for a moment, looking toward the entrance before getting closer. Some nights, I would pretend not to look at all, because I did not want to find her staring at the door again. But every time I saw her, the pattern stayed the same. She was there first. She was looking at my door. She noticed me. She walked away. I tried to figure out where she went. That was another thing that bothered me. She always seemed to disappear quickly, but not dramatically. I did not see her vanish into thin air. It was more like she moved away at just the right time, slipping into darkness, around the side of the building, or beyond my view. Still, I never saw her enter another apartment. I never saw her walk toward a car. I never saw her meet anyone. I never saw her take the same route twice. She was simply gone. After a while, I started wondering whether I should say something to my parents. But I knew how it would sound. There is a woman who keeps standing outside our apartment at night. They would probably ask if she threatened me. They would ask what she looked like. They would ask why I had not spoken to her, and I did not have good answers. She had not done anything obvious. She had not tried to get inside. She had not knocked. She had not followed me. She had not even spoken. So I kept it to myself for a while. Eventually, though, I told the landlord. I did not start by saying I thought the apartment was haunted. I did not mention ghosts. I just told him that there was a woman who seemed to stand outside my door at night and leave whenever I got home. I expected him to be concerned. I thought he might say he would look into it, check security, speak with the neighbors, or ask whether I could describe her. Instead, he reacted in a way I did not expect. He told me a woman named Anna had died in that apartment 19 years earlier. He said she had died because of domestic abuse. Then he joked that it sounded like a cliché ghost haunting. I remember feeling cold when he said it. For a second, I did not know whether to laugh, get angry, or ask him more questions. The landlord acted like it was almost amusing. Maybe he did not believe in ghosts. Maybe he thought he was making a harmless joke. Maybe he had heard the story from older tenants and did not take it seriously. But I was not laughing. I had been seeing a woman staring at that same door for months. And suddenly he was telling me that someone named Anna had died there almost 2 decades earlier. It was hard not to connect the two things. I asked him if he was serious. I do not remember exactly what he said after that. Maybe he told me the story was true, but that he was only joking about the ghost part. Maybe he said the apartment had a history, but that nothing strange had ever happened before. Maybe he told me not to worry. But I could not stop thinking about it. Anna, the name stayed in my mind. I began thinking about the woman outside my door differently. Before, she had been an unexplained stranger. Now, she had become a possibility. A person with a name. A person who had once lived in the place where I slept. A person who had supposedly died because someone hurt her. That made every late walk home worse. I did not want to see her again. But at the same time, part of me wanted to know. I wanted an answer. I wanted to know if the landlord had only planted the idea in my mind. Maybe the woman I saw had been real all along, and now I was simply making a ghost story out of it because he gave me a name. I told myself that was probably what happened. Maybe she was a neighbor. Maybe she had some reason to stand there. Maybe I had never paid attention to how she left because I was tired and nervous. Maybe the landlord's story had turned something ordinary into something frightening. But then she came back. One night, I got off the bus after tutoring and walked toward the apartment building. It was late. The street was quiet. I could see the entrance from a distance. And there she was, standing in front of my door, the same way as always, still watching it. I stopped walking for a moment. My heart started pounding. The name came into my mind before I could stop it. Anna. I had spent days telling myself I would not let the landlord's story affect me. I had told myself I would not be scared of something I could not prove. I had told myself that if I saw her again, I would simply walk past and ignore it. But that night, I decided to do something different. I decided to speak to her. I do not know where the courage came from. Maybe I was tired of being afraid. Maybe I was angry that she had been outside my door for months. Maybe I was scared enough that I needed the uncertainty to end. Or maybe I simply thought that if she was a real person, speaking to her would force the situation into something normal. I kept walking toward the entrance. She was still facing the door. I was close enough now that I could see her outline clearly. My hands felt cold. My throat felt tight. Then I said it. "Are you Anna?" The words sounded louder than I expected in the quiet street. For a moment, nothing happened. She did not move. She did not speak. She just stood there. Then she stopped in her tracks. It was a small movement, but it felt huge. She had been walking away from me, as she always did, but after I said her name, she paused. The night seemed completely silent. I remember waiting for her to turn around. Part of me wanted her to. Part of me hoped she would not. Then she turned. Slowly, she looked at me, and she smiled. I will never forget that smile. It was not a huge grin. It was not frightening in the way a horror movie smile is frightening. It was small, quiet, almost sad, like she had been waiting for someone to recognize her, like she had heard something she had not expected to hear. For a second, I could not move. I did not know what to say. I did not know whether I should ask another question, apologize, run, or just stand there. She did not speak. She only smiled. Then, after that night, she never appeared again. That was the strangest part. For 4 months, I had seen her again and again. She would stand outside my apartment door staring at it. She would leave when I came home. Then I asked whether she was Anna. She turned around. She smiled. And she was gone from my life. I never saw her outside the apartment again. I never saw anyone standing at my door late at night after that. I never heard footsteps outside. I never saw another shadow move away as I approached. The routine ended as suddenly as it had begun. For a while, I expected her to come back. Every late night after tutoring, I would get off the bus and look toward the entrance before I got close. I would feel that same nervous tightness in my stomach. I would scan the doorway, the walkway, the shadows near the building. But she was never there. Eventually, I stopped expecting her, but I never stopped thinking about her. Even now, I cannot say what I saw. Maybe she was a real woman. Maybe she was someone who lived nearby and had personal reasons for standing outside that door. Maybe she was waiting for someone. Maybe she had some mental health struggle. Maybe she was lonely. Maybe I only saw her during the months when her routine happened to line up with mine. Maybe the landlord's story was coincidence. Maybe the name Anna was just a story attached to an old apartment. Maybe he had told it because he thought it was funny. Maybe he had no idea how seriously I would take it. Maybe when I asked the woman if she was Anna, she smiled because she thought I was talking to someone else, or because she found it strange. Maybe afterward she simply stopped coming by. Those are all possible explanations. I know that. But they do not explain why I had seen her repeatedly for 4 months. They do not explain why she always stared at my specific apartment door. They do not explain why she always walked away when I arrived. And they do not explain why she stopped appearing after I spoke the name out loud. Sometimes I wonder whether I should have asked her more. I wonder whether I should have said something else after she smiled. I could have asked if she needed help. I could have asked why she stood there. I could have asked whether she had lived in the apartment. But in that moment, I was too shocked to think. The smile was enough. It felt like an answer without words. Not a clear answer. Not something I could explain to another person, but something that made the whole experience feel finished. That was what stayed with me most. Not fear, exactly. At first, I had been frightened. I was a high school student coming home alone at midnight, seeing a woman standing outside my door again and again. Anyone would be uneasy. But after that last night, the fear changed into fascination. I started wondering about the people who lived in places before us. We move into apartments and assume they are empty when we arrive. We see new paint, clean floors, furniture, our own belongings. We think of the place as ours because we have the key, but there may be years of life hidden inside the walls. Arguments, birthdays, illnesses, losses, people who were happy there, people who were afraid there, people who left, people who never got the chance to leave. I do not know whether Anna was real in the way I believe she was. I do not know whether I saw a ghost. I do not know whether the landlord's story shaped what I thought I saw. But I know what it felt like to walk home after midnight and see a woman staring at my apartment door. I know what it felt like to say her name, and I know what it felt like when she turned around and smiled. She never appeared again, but she left me with a strange fascination that has never completely gone away. Even now, years later, I can still picture that walkway at night, the bus stop behind me, the dark street, the apartment entrance ahead, and a woman standing quietly in front of my door, looking at it as though she was waiting for something she had lost a long time ago. I worked late nights as a closing cashier, and most nights I drove home when the world was already asleep. Closing shifts have their own kind of exhaustion. By the time the store was shut down, the registers were counted, the last customers had finally left, and the lights were being turned down, I was usually running on whatever energy I had left from coffee, snacks, and the need to get home. There is something strange about leaving work after midnight. During the day, a drive home can feel ordinary. There are other cars on the road. There are lights in houses. Gas stations are open. People are out doing errands. Even if you live in a quiet place, there is usually some sign that the world is still awake. But after a closing shift, especially when you live far from town, the road feels different. I lived in what most people would call a middle-of-nowhere area. There were houses, but they were spread far apart. You could drive for long stretches without passing a porch light or another vehicle. There were fields, trees, ditches, dark driveways, and roads that seemed to disappear into the blackness ahead of your headlights. The closer I got to home, the fewer signs of people there were. There were no busy intersections, no lines of cars, no late-night restaurants glowing in the distance, no apartment buildings with windows lit up high above the street, just narrow roads, dark land, and the beam of my headlights reaching forward a short distance before everything vanished into the night again. I was used to it. At least, I thought I was. When you drive the same route enough times, you learn the shapes of it. You know where the road curves. You know which trees lean close to the pavement. You know where there are mailboxes, barns, side roads, and empty fields. You know which areas are completely dark and which ones have a light on in a house set back from the road. You start recognizing what belongs there. That night, I had worked another late closing shift. Nothing dramatic had happened at work. It had been the usual kind of night. Customers lingering until the last minute, people showing up right before closing, coworkers wanting to get out as soon as possible, and all the small tasks that take longer when everyone is tired. By the time I left, it was around midnight. The parking lot was mostly empty. The bright lights of the store looked strange after spending hours under them. I got into my car, started it up, and headed home. At first, the drive was normal. There were a few streetlights near town. I passed a gas station, a dark strip mall, some houses, and the usual places I saw every night after work. Then I got farther out, and the roads became darker. The quiet set in. There were no cars in front of me, no headlights coming toward me, no trucks parked along the side of the road. No people walking. My headlights lit the pavement, the yellow lines, and whatever was close enough to the road. Beyond that, there was nothing but darkness. I remember being tired, but alert enough to drive. I had that usual end-of-shift feeling where your body wants to sleep, but your mind is still running through little pieces of the night. Maybe I was thinking about something a customer said. Maybe I was planning what I would eat when I got home. Maybe I was just staring at the road and waiting for the drive to be over. Then I noticed lights ahead. At first, I thought they were normal. A house, maybe, a vehicle coming around a bend, a distant farm light, construction equipment, something along those lines. But the farther I drove, the stranger they looked. The night was completely black around them. There was no moonlight that I remember, no glow from town, no traffic, and no other nearby light sources. That made the lights stand out sharply. They were not far away. That was what made me pay attention. They were close enough that I could tell they were not stars. They were not distant aircraft lights high in the sky. They were somewhere ahead of me, in the sky or just above the land, but not so far away that I could dismiss them as something on the horizon. I slowed down. For a few seconds, I told myself it had to be something simple. Maybe a tall construction crane with lights on it. Maybe equipment in a field. Maybe a utility crew working on something. Maybe an unusually bright house or a farm building that I had never noticed before. But I drove that road often. I knew what was there. There was not usually construction equipment sitting out in the middle of nowhere with bright lights shining in the middle of the night. There was no airport nearby that I knew of. There was no reason for something to be hovering or glowing ahead of me where the road passed through open, dark land. The lights did not look like regular headlights either. They were not moving toward me along the road. They were not positioned like a car, truck, or motorcycle. They were above the line of the road, ahead of me, and they seemed too steady to be normal aircraft lights. I kept driving slowly until I reached the point where I could see them more clearly. Then I stopped my car in the middle of the road. I know that sounds dangerous. Normally, stopping in the middle of a road at midnight is not a smart thing to do. But there were no other cars around. The road was empty in both directions. I could see enough ahead and behind me to know I was alone. I put the car in park, and I watched. The lights were strange. I wish I could give a perfect description, but it has been hard to put into words even for myself. I remember that there was more than one light. I remember that they were bright enough to stand out against the black sky. I remember that they seemed to be connected to something, or at least positioned in a way that made them look organized rather than random. They did not blink in a normal pattern. They did not move like an airplane crossing the sky. They did not drift like a helicopter with a searchlight. They did not have the steady engine sound I expected from anything nearby. That was one of the things that bothered me most. Whatever it was seemed close. Close enough that I should have heard something. A plane that low or that near should make noise. A helicopter should make noise. Construction equipment should make noise. A truck or large machine should make noise. But I heard nothing. No engine, no propellers, no distant rumble, no machinery. The only sound was my car idling. Maybe there was a little wind outside, maybe insects, maybe the faint sound of tires on distant pavement. But there was no clear sound connected to the lights. I rolled down my window for a moment. The night air came in, cool compared to the warmth of the car. I listened. Nothing. That made the whole thing feel worse. If I had heard a helicopter, I would have been relieved. If I had heard a generator or machinery, I would have been relieved. If I had seen a crane or utility truck, I would have laughed at myself for stopping. But there was no obvious explanation, just lights in the darkness. I sat there for a while, trying to decide what I was looking at. Part of me wanted to drive closer. Part of me wanted to turn around. Part of me wanted to take a picture or video, but I knew how useless it would probably be. It was dark. I was inside my car, and cameras at the time did not always capture distant lights well. A photo might have shown nothing but a few blurry dots, and anyone looking at it later could say it was a reflection, a street light, a lens flare, or a plane. I did not want to create bad evidence. I wanted to understand what I was seeing, but I could not. I kept staring. The lights remained in the same general area. They were not racing across the sky. They were not coming toward me. They were not getting obviously smaller or larger. They just stayed there, bright and impossible to place against the dark landscape. I remember feeling a kind of unease that was different from ordinary fear. It was not the fear of someone standing by the side of the road. It was not the fear of an animal running into the car. It was not the fear of being lost. It was the feeling that I was looking at something I had no category for. When you grow up driving rural roads at night, you learn what things look like in the dark. You learn the difference between a house light and a car light. You learn how a distant truck looks through trees. You learn how fog changes headlights. You learn the shapes of barns, poles, power lines, and equipment. This did not look familiar. I remember checking my mirrors, even though I do not know why. Maybe I was afraid someone would come up behind me. Maybe stopping in the middle of the road had made me feel exposed. Maybe I was simply trying to ground myself by looking at something normal. But there was no one behind me. The road was empty. I looked forward again. The lights were still there. I did not know how long I sat there. It could have been a few minutes. It could have been longer. Time feels strange when you are staring at something you cannot explain. Eventually, I decided I needed to leave. I did not want to sit there all night. I did not want to get closer. I did not want to be the person who drove towards something strange in the sky or a dark field just because curiosity got the better of them. So I drove on. I kept checking the area as I passed, trying to figure out whether the lights were coming from something on the ground. Maybe there was a road I had not noticed. Maybe there was a work site farther back in the trees. Maybe there was a field entrance where equipment had been parked. But I did not see anything that made sense. I drove home with the image stuck in my mind. Once I got inside, I kept thinking about it. I tried to explain it in practical ways. Construction equipment was the first possibility. Maybe there was a crew working late. Maybe they had brought in machinery. Maybe the lights were mounted high enough that they looked like they were in the sky. Maybe the darkness had made the distance impossible to judge. That sounded reasonable, but I could not remember any construction in the area. There had been no cones, no signs, no road closures, no trucks, no equipment, and no warning lights. The road had looked normal. Then I considered aircraft. Maybe it had been a helicopter. Maybe it had been a small plane flying low. Maybe it had been something from a nearby airport or military training route. But again, there had been no sound, and the lights did not move like an aircraft. I thought about a drone, but the same problem remained. Whatever I saw looked too large or too bright to be an ordinary drone, and I did not hear the buzzing sound I would expect if it was close enough for me to see so clearly. I thought about reflections. Maybe something in my windshield had reflected the dashboard lights onto the glass. Maybe a light from my car had created an image that seemed to be ahead of me. Maybe I had been looking through a dirty windshield and mistook some reflection for lights in the sky. But when I rolled down the window, the lights were still there. That was why I could not dismiss it as a reflection. The next day, I went back through the area in daylight. I did not want to leave it as a mystery. I was driving to work, and as I reached the spot where I had stopped the night before, I paid close attention. I looked to both sides of the road. I looked toward the fields. I looked for construction equipment, poles, towers, signs, parked machinery, anything that could have created lights where I had seen them. There was nothing. No work site, no tall equipment, no crane, no generator, no utility truck, no construction signs, no new building, no bright lights mounted on a structure, nothing at all that explained what I saw. The area looked almost too normal in daylight. There were the same fields, trees, open land, and roadside ditches I had driven past many times before. The place where I had stopped my car was just a quiet, rural road. There was no obvious point where something large could have been sitting or hovering. I drove more slowly than usual, looking carefully. Maybe I had misjudged the location. Maybe the lights had been farther away than I thought. Maybe they came from a distant farm or road that was hidden in the darkness. But I did not find anything. That made the whole experience harder to let go of. If I had found a work site, I could have laughed at myself. If I had found a tower or a building with floodlights, I could have been relieved. If I had seen a new construction project, a set of power lines, or some equipment parked in a field, I could have told myself that the mystery was solved. But there was nothing. I went to work that night still thinking about it. I wondered whether I would see the lights again on the way home. Part of me hoped I would, because then maybe I could get a better look. Maybe I could record them. Maybe I could figure out whether they were moving, whether they had a pattern, or whether they came from the ground. But another part of me hoped I would never see them again, because the truth was, I had not felt excited while I watched them. I had felt uneasy. There is a difference between seeing something interesting and seeing something that does not make sense. Interesting things make you curious. Unexplainable things make you feel small. I kept asking myself why I stopped the car. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe I had been so tired after work that I did not process the risk of stopping in the road. Maybe the lights were simply unusual enough that I had to see whether they were real. But once I was there, alone in the middle of a dark road, listening for a sound that never came, I understood why people get scared of things in the sky. It is not always because they believe in aliens. It is because the sky is supposed to be too far away to affect you. When something in it feels close, quiet, and unfamiliar, it changes the whole world around you. The road feels smaller. The car feels less safe. The darkness feels deeper. I never got a definite answer. Maybe it was construction equipment I failed to see the next day. Maybe it was lights from a farm hidden beyond the fields. Maybe it was an aircraft at an angle that made it appear stationary. Maybe weather, darkness, and distance played tricks on me. Maybe I was tired enough that my brain misunderstood something ordinary. All of those explanations are possible, but none of them has ever fit perfectly. I know what I saw. There were strange lights in the sky ahead of me. It was midnight. The road was empty. The lights were close enough that I expected to hear something. I heard nothing. Then I went back in daylight and found no sign of any equipment, construction, or structure that could explain them. I have thought about it many times since then. Sometimes I laugh a little when I remember stopping my car in the middle of nowhere just to stare at lights. It sounds like something from a movie. A person on their way home from a late shift, exhausted, alone, seeing something strange over a dark field. But when I remember the actual feeling of it, I do not laugh. I remember how black the night was. I remember how far I was from other houses. I remember the engine of my car idling while I sat there listening. I remember the lights hanging ahead of me without a sound. And I remember driving past the same place in daylight, looking for a reasonable explanation, and finding nothing. Maybe the truth really is out there. Or maybe the truth is that some things only make sense while you are looking at them. and once the sun comes up, they disappear without leaving anything behind. I was walking through a wide jogging path in the evening. I do not know the exact English word for that kind of place, but it was a broad path meant for people to walk, run, cycle, or exercise. It was not a narrow forest trail, and it was not a busy street either. It was one of those open paths where people normally go jogging during the day. By the time I was walking there, it was already dark. The path had streetlights spaced along it, so it was not completely black, but the light only reached certain parts of the ground. Between the lamps, there were darker stretches where the shadows seemed deeper. The light made the pavement look pale, while everything beyond the edge of the path disappeared into darkness. During the day, it was probably a normal place. People ran there. Families may have walked there. Dog owners probably used it. Maybe there were benches, trees, grass, or open space along the sides. But at night, when there were fewer people around and the only light came from the lamps above, it felt very different. The path seemed longer. The empty space around it seemed wider. Every sound carried farther than it should have. I do not remember exactly where I had been going. Maybe I was walking home. Maybe I had been out with friends. Maybe I had gone somewhere nearby and was taking the route back because it was familiar. What I do remember is that I was alone. There were no people close to me. There were no joggers coming toward me, no bikes passing by, no one talking in the distance. The air was quiet, and the only sounds I remember were my own footsteps and maybe the faint hum of the streetlights. At first, nothing felt wrong. I was just walking. Then I started getting the feeling that something was behind me. It did not begin with a sound. I did not hear footsteps clearly. I did not hear anyone call my name. I did not see a shadow move in front of me. It was just a feeling. The kind of feeling that makes you suddenly aware of the space behind your back. I tried to ignore it at first. Everyone gets that feeling sometimes, especially at night. You are walking alone, it is dark, and your brain becomes more alert. You start noticing every little thing. A tree branch moving in the wind can feel like someone stepping closer. A distant sound can make you turn your head. Even your own shadow can look strange under streetlights. I told myself that was probably what was happening. I was 16. I was alone in the dark. Of course I felt nervous. But the feeling did not go away. It became stronger. It felt like I was not simply imagining someone behind me. It felt like there was something close enough that if I turned around, I would see it. I slowed down. Then I stopped. For a moment, I stood there facing forward, trying to decide whether I should turn around. Part of me did not want to. There is something strange about that moment before you look. You know that if nothing is there, you will feel stupid for being scared. But if something is there, you cannot take it back. You cannot unsee it. I remember standing in the pool of light from one of the street lamps, feeling the darkness behind me. Then I turned around, and I saw them. There were two figures standing on the path behind me. At first, my brain could not understand what I was looking at. They were huge, much too huge. They looked around 2 meters tall, maybe even taller. But their height was not the only thing that made them strange. Their bodies were enormous and round, almost like perfect circles. They were fat, wide, and symmetrical in a way that did not seem natural. They did not look like people wearing heavy clothes. They did not look like animals standing at a strange angle. They did not look like anything I had ever seen before. The closest thing I can say is that they had the heads of hogs. Their heads were shaped like pigs or wild boars with upright ears. But they were not normal pig heads. They were darker, more shadow-like, and harder to see clearly. I could make out the general shape, but not every feature. They had ears that stood up. They had large, heavy-looking heads. They had thick, round bodies, and they were standing upright. That was one of the things that terrified me the most. They did not move like normal animals. They were not on four legs. They were upright, large, and dark against the streetlights. At first I froze. I did not scream. I did not run right away. I stood there and stared at them because I could not believe they were real. I remember thinking that there had to be another explanation. Maybe they were people. Maybe they were costumes. Maybe they were some weird statue or display. Maybe they were shadows from something behind them. Maybe I was seeing the light wrong. But they moved. They were jumping back and forth, not running toward me, not walking away, not acting like normal people or animals. They were jumping side to side, almost in rhythm. It was like they were moving to a beat only they could hear. The more I watched them, the more unreal it became. They would shift one way, then the other. Their huge round bodies moved with a strange rhythm, as if they were dancing or bouncing. At the time, it was terrifying. Now when I think about it, there is something almost ridiculous about the image. Two giant hog-shaped figures jumping back and forth in the darkness sounds absurd. Sometimes I can laugh at the memory because it sounds so strange. But in that moment, it was not funny. It was the most scared I had ever been. I remember staring at them for a while because I wanted to make sure I was not imagining them. That may sound strange. Most people would turn around and run immediately. But I think I was in shock. My mind was trying to force the scene into something normal. I kept looking at them. I blinked. I looked away for a second and looked back. They were still there. They were not disappearing. They were not changing into bushes or people. They stayed in the same place, still jumping, still moving back and forth, still shaped like huge round creatures with hog heads and upright ears. The streetlights made them look like shadows, but they were too solid to be ordinary shadows. They were dark, almost black, but they had shape and weight. The light behind them or around them did not reveal much detail. It only made their outlines stand out more clearly. I could not see their eyes. I could not see their mouths. I could not see whether they had hands, hooves, claws, or something else. But I could see enough to know they did not look like any animal I knew. There were no animals in my country that looked like that. There were no giant upright hogs wandering around on jogging paths at night. There were no wild animals with round bodies like perfect circles and ears sticking up while they jumped back and forth under streetlights. Even if there had been some kind of animal nearby, it would not have moved like that. It would not have stood upright. It would not have seemed so enormous, and it would not have looked so perfectly strange. I remember the moment when fear finally broke through the shock. My body suddenly understood that I needed to get away. I did not think about whether they could chase me. I did not think about where I should go. I did not think about looking behind me again. I just ran. I have never run that fast in my life. I ran as hard as I could. The path ahead of me became a blur of streetlights and darkness. My feet hit the pavement hard. My breathing became loud in my ears. I could feel my heart pounding so hard that it almost hurt. I did not know whether they were following me. I did not want to look. Every instinct told me not to turn around. I kept running. The path felt endless. Every streetlight I passed seemed too far away. Every dark space between them felt like a place where something could be waiting. I was terrified that I would hear heavy footsteps behind me, or see one of those round black figures leap into the light ahead of me. But I did not hear anything. At least, not anything clear. Maybe I heard my own footsteps so loudly that I could not hear the rest of the world. Maybe my blood was rushing in my ears. Maybe there were sounds behind me, but fear made it impossible to separate them from everything else. I just ran. Eventually, I reached a place where there were more lights, more buildings, or some sign of people. I do not remember exactly where I stopped. I only remember that I finally slowed down when I felt like I had put enough distance between myself and whatever I had seen. I was shaking. My lungs hurt. My legs felt weak. I stood there trying to catch my breath, looking back in the direction I had come from. The path behind me was empty. There were streetlights. There was darkness. There were shadows along the sides. But I could not see the figures anymore. I did not go back to check. There was no chance of that. I was too scared. For the rest of that night, I could not stop thinking about them. I replayed the image over and over. Two giant figures, hog-like heads, upright ears, round, almost perfectly circular bodies, jumping from side to side in rhythm. I kept wondering whether I had seen something real. I did not know what I could possibly tell anyone. If I said I had seen two giant pig creatures on a jogging path, people would laugh. It sounded like a dream. It sounded like something from a cartoon or a horror game. But I knew what I saw. Or, at least, I knew what I believed I saw. That was the part that bothered me. I had never had hallucinations before. I had never seen things that did not exist. I had never had an experience where I looked directly at something, stared at it, blinked, looked again, and still could not make sense of it. I was not drunk. I was not on drugs. I was not falling asleep. I was walking outside, awake, and aware of where I was. That made it harder to dismiss. For a long time, I tried to explain it logically. Maybe there were two people in costumes. That was one possibility. Maybe there had been some kind of event nearby. Maybe people were wearing large masks or padded costumes. Maybe the streetlights made their bodies look rounder and darker than they really were. But even then, why would they be jumping back and forth on an empty jogging path at night? Why would they be dressed like huge hogs? Why would they stand there in silence, moving in rhythm, instead of talking, laughing, or reacting when they saw a teenager staring at them? Maybe they were people playing a prank. Teenagers do strange things. People put on costumes to scare others. It is possible that they saw me coming and decided to act creepy. But if it was a prank, it was an extremely strange one. There was no laughter. No one shouted after me. No one chased me. No one came forward afterward and said it was a joke. The figures did not even seem to care that I was there. They were just moving, back and forth, like they were following some rhythm that existed only for them. I thought about animals, too. Maybe they were large animals standing in the dark, and my brain turned them into something much stranger because of the lighting. Maybe they were cows, dogs, deer, or something else that looked distorted under the streetlights. But there were no animals in my country that matched what I saw, and even if there had been, the shape was wrong. The bodies were too round. The heads were too hog-like. The ears were too upright. The height was wrong. The movement was wrong. Nothing fit. I wondered if it was some kind of visual illusion. Maybe two bushes or trees had been caught in the right light. Maybe there were shadows from streetlights, poles, signs, or objects I could not see. Maybe the movement came from wind-moving branches, and my fear turned it into bodies jumping side to side. But I stared at them. They were not still objects. They moved too clearly. They seemed to have weight. They had a rhythm. They looked like they were alive. I know memory changes over time. I know that when something scares you, your mind can make it bigger afterward. You remember it as taller, darker, closer, stranger, and more threatening than it may have actually been. Maybe they were not exactly 2 meters tall. Maybe the bodies were not as perfectly round as I remember. Maybe the ears were not as clear as they seemed. Maybe the darkness filled in parts of the image, and over the years my memory has made the figures more detailed. I understand that, but the core of the experience has never changed. I was walking through a wide jogging path in the dark. I felt something behind me. I turned around. I saw two massive dark figures that looked like upright hogs. They were jumping back and forth. I stared at them long enough to make sure I was not imagining it. Then I ran faster than I had ever run before. That part has always stayed the same. Sometimes I wonder whether fear itself can create images that feel completely real. Maybe when you are alone at night, your brain becomes too alert. It starts searching for danger. It sees patterns in shadows. It turns vague shapes into creatures because it would rather make a mistake than miss a real threat. That is how survival works. Your brain would rather think a shadow is an animal than ignore an animal that could hurt you. Maybe mine did that. Maybe I saw two strange-shaped objects or people under the lights, and my brain turned them into huge hog-like creatures because I was already feeling watched. But even if that is true, the experience felt real enough to scare me more than anything else in my life. I still remember the shape of their bodies. That is what makes it hard to forget. They were big and fat, but not in a normal animal way. They were round as if someone had drawn them with a compass. Their bodies seemed almost perfectly symmetrical, huge circles with heads attached. The heads looked like hog heads, wide and heavy, with ears that pointed upward. They were not like wild boars, pigs, or anything I had ever seen in real life. They did not look natural. They looked like something someone had imagined after seeing an animal in a nightmare, and they were moving. That was what made it impossible to turn them into statues or shadows. They were jumping from side to side, not slowly, not in a way that looked like walking. It was almost playful, except there was nothing playful about the way it felt. They looked like they were dancing, like they were keeping time to music I could not hear, like they had been doing it before I noticed them and would keep doing it after I ran away. For years afterward, I avoided thinking about it too deeply. I did not want to give it more power. I did not want to convince myself that I had seen something supernatural. I did not want to become the person who told everyone they saw monsters in the dark. But the memory stayed. Sometimes it returns when I am walking alone at night. Sometimes it comes back when I pass through a place lit only by streetlights. Sometimes it comes back when I hear distant footsteps behind me, even if I know they belong to another person. I will suddenly remember that feeling, the sense that something was behind me, the moment I turned around, the shock of seeing two things that should not have existed, and the absolute panic that came after. Now, I can laugh a little when I describe them. Two giant round hog creatures jumping back and forth on a jogging path sounds ridiculous when you say it out loud. It sounds like something from a strange animated movie. It sounds almost funny. But I was not laughing then. I was frozen. I was staring. And when I finally ran, I ran like I believed those things could catch me. I still do not know what they were. Maybe they were delusions. Maybe they were a trick of the dark. Maybe they were people in costumes. Maybe they were animals seen from a strange angle. Maybe I was exhausted, stressed, or afraid before I even turned around, and my mind created something from shadows. But they were so real to me. I had never seen something that did not exist before, and I have never seen anything like them since. That is why I still remember them so clearly, not because I know what they were, but because I do not. We will get back to the next confession in a moment. If you are new here, Subscribe to Dead Air Confessions for more real stories from people who experienced something they still cannot explain. Your support helps keep these late-night broadcasts alive. You can also leave a like and tell me which story has unsettled you the most so far. Now, let's return to the signal. When I was around 8 or 9 years old, I was outside playing in my cousin's front yard when I saw something I still cannot explain. It was one of those ordinary childhood afternoons that should not have stayed in my memory forever. I was just outside, probably doing whatever kids do when adults are inside talking and you are too young to care about time. Maybe we were running around, playing with toys, drawing in the driveway, kicking something across the grass, or just finding ways to keep ourselves busy. My cousin lived in a place where you could see a long stretch of road from the front yard. The house was set back enough that there was open space between the yard and the road. Beyond that were more yards, trees, maybe fields or patches of land, and the road continuing into the distance. It was not a crowded city street with traffic every few seconds. Cars passed sometimes, but there were also long, quiet stretches where you could look down the road and see almost nothing moving. That day, the weather was clear enough for me to see far away. I remember standing in the yard and looking toward the road. At first, I did not think I was seeing anything strange. There was a person dressed in white near the side of the road, maybe 70 or 80 yards away. I did not know the exact distance then, of course. I was a child. I only knew they were far enough away that I could not see their face clearly, but close enough that I could tell it was shaped like a person. The figure was completely dressed in white. That was the first thing that stood out. Not just a white shirt and light pants, or someone wearing ordinary clothes that happened to look pale from a distance. The whole figure looked white. It was bright against the darker road and the land around it. The white clothing made it easy to notice, even from far away. The person seemed to be looking down at the road. Their head was tilted slightly forward, as though they were watching the pavement or staring at something below them. At first, I thought maybe they were waiting for someone. Maybe they had dropped something. Maybe they were looking at the ground because they had seen an animal, a coin, a piece of trash, or something else near the road. There were plenty of normal possibilities. I did not feel scared right away. I just watched. For about 30 seconds, maybe longer, I stood there looking at the person in white. The longer I watched, the more I realized something was wrong. They did not move, not even a little. They did not shift their weight from one foot to the other. They did not raise a hand. They did not turn their head. They did not look up. They did not bend down. They did not take a step. They were completely still. At first, I wondered if they were a statue, but that did not make sense. There was no reason for a statue to be standing beside the road. It did not look like a road sign or yard decoration. It did not look like a scarecrow. It looked like a person. The shape was human. The posture was human. The clothing looked like clothing. But the stillness was strange. Even when people are standing still, they move a little. They breathe. They adjust their posture. Their arms shift. Their head turns. They react to cars, wind, sound, or whatever is happening around them. This person did none of that. They stayed in the exact same position. The road was quiet. The yard was quiet. I stood there watching. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The figure was not standing on the ground. It was floating. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I looked harder. I blinked. I tried to see whether there was grass, a curb, or some raised piece of land below their feet. But there was a gap. The figure seemed to be hovering maybe a foot above the ground, not high in the air, not flying, just suspended. The feet, or where the feet should have been, did not touch the road or the grass beside it. The figure was hanging slightly above the surface, completely still, as though the ground beneath it did not matter. I remember feeling confused before I felt afraid. My mind could not make sense of it. I was young enough that I did not immediately think, this must be a ghost. I did not have a perfect category for what I was seeing. I only knew that people were supposed to stand on the ground. This person was not. I stared at the gap beneath them. I remember trying to convince myself that I was seeing it wrong. Maybe the road dipped there. Maybe there was a shadow that made it look like their feet were not touching the ground. Maybe they were standing on something I could not see. Maybe the white clothes made the lower part of their body blend into the background. But the more I looked, the clearer it seemed. They were floating. They were still looking down. They had not moved once. The sight of them became more frightening the longer I watched. There is a strange kind of fear that happens when you do not understand what you are seeing. It is not like seeing an animal that might bite you, or a person who might be dangerous. It is worse in a way, because your mind cannot decide what kind of threat it is. You do not know whether to run. You do not know whether to call someone. You do not know whether you are imagining it. You just stand there, staring, hoping it will turn into something normal. I remember looking around the yard for my cousin. I may have wanted to ask if they saw it too. I may have wanted someone else to confirm that I was not making it up. But before I could say anything, my cousin suddenly yelled for me to get inside. I do not remember exactly what they said. It may have been my name. It may have been something like, "Come inside." It may have been said sharply enough that I knew I was supposed to listen. The sound snapped me out of staring. I turned toward the house. For a second, I hesitated, because I wanted to look back at the person in white one more time. Then I did, and it was gone. There was nothing there. No person, no white clothes, no shape beside the road, no one walking away, no car nearby, no movement in the grass, nothing. The road looked empty. That was what made the fear hit me all at once. If the figure had been a person, they should have still been there. Even if they had started walking away, I should have seen them. There was no place for them to disappear in the second or two it took me to turn toward the house and look back. The road was open. The area around it was open. They had been visible from the yard. Then they were gone. I ran inside. I do not remember whether I told my cousin or an adult right away. I do not remember whether anyone believed me. Childhood memories can blur around the edges, especially the parts after a frightening event. I remember the figure more clearly than I remember the conversations afterward. But I know I was scared, even though the figure had never moved toward me, even though it never spoke, even though it did not raise its head or make any sound. The fact that it simply stood there, floating above the ground and looking down at the road, was enough. For a long time afterward, I thought about it whenever I was outside in that yard. I would look toward the road and wonder whether I would see the figure again. I would scan the same spot where it had been. Sometimes I would expect to see a flash of white standing in the distance. Sometimes I would avoid looking entirely. The strange thing was that I never saw it again. Not in that yard, not on that road, not anywhere else. It happened once, lasted less than a minute, and then became one of those memories that never fully leaves you. As I got older, I tried to come up with logical explanations. Maybe it was someone wearing a white coat or dress. Maybe it was a person standing on a low wall, curb, or raised piece of ground that I could not see clearly from where I was. Maybe the road had a slope, and the angle made it look like they were floating. Maybe they were standing behind something pale that blended into the background. Maybe there was a bright reflection from the sun that made the lower part of their body disappear. Maybe I saw a scarecrow or some kind of object placed near the road. Maybe it was a real person, and I just misunderstood the distance. All of those explanations are possible. Memory can also change over time. When you are 8 or 9, your sense of distance is not perfect. Something that seemed 70 or 80 yards away could have been closer or farther. A person who looked like they were floating could have been standing in a ditch, on a raised patch of ground, or behind a piece of brush. A child's brain can fill in details. It can turn a dark shape into a person, or a bright object into white clothing. It can make an ordinary moment feel stranger, because the memory becomes attached to fear. I know that. But there are details I cannot let go of. The figure did not move, not once. It was not shifting like a person standing in the distance. It was not moving like someone looking for something along the road. It was still, perfectly still. And I remember the gap beneath it, the fact that the figure did not seem connected to the ground. I also remember how clear the white looked. The road and the land around it were darker. The figure stood out as if someone had placed a white cutout against the background. It looked too bright, too separate, and too quiet. Sometimes, I think maybe it was simply light. Maybe the sun was at the right angle. Maybe a white object caught the light in a way that made it seem human-shaped. Maybe the shimmer of heat or distance distorted it. Maybe I stared too long, and my eyes started turning an ordinary object into something more familiar. That is possible. The human brain is always looking for faces and bodies. It sees people in tree trunks, animals in clouds, and movement in shadows. A few lines and colors can become a person if your mind expects one. But I did not see a vague shape. I saw what looked like a person dressed in all white. I watched them long enough to notice they never moved. I watched them long enough to realize they were floating. Then my cousin called for me. Then it vanished. The memory has stayed vivid because it happened in daylight or near daylight, not in the middle of the night. If it had happened in darkness, I could blame it more easily on shadows. If it had happened when I was half asleep, I could blame it on a dream. If it had happened in a haunted house or an old cemetery, people would expect a ghost story. But it happened outside in a front yard. It happened while I was awake and playing. It happened on an ordinary day. The road was there, the yard was there, my cousin was nearby. Everything around me was normal. Then something appeared that did not fit. Sometimes I wonder whether my cousin saw it too. I do not know if they yelled for me to get inside because they noticed the figure, or because it was simply time to come in. Maybe the adults had called us. Maybe dinner was ready. Maybe it was getting late. Maybe my cousin had no idea what I was staring at. But the timing made it feel important. I was looking at the figure. My cousin yelled. I turned away. The figure disappeared. That sequence became locked in my mind. I have wondered whether it was a person who suddenly stepped behind something when I looked away. Maybe there was a tree, pole, or roadside object I forgot about. Maybe they walked into a driveway or behind a parked vehicle. But from where I stood, the road seemed open. I remember the person being visible in a clear area. I remember looking back and finding nothing. Maybe my memory has simplified the landscape over the years. Maybe there were more trees or buildings than I remember. Maybe the road had curves, dips, or hidden places that made it easier for someone to disappear. That could be true. Still, the feeling remains. I felt like I saw something that was not supposed to be there. Not something evil, not something that tried to hurt me, not something that came closer. Just something impossible, standing beside a road, looking down, floating in silence. Sometimes I wonder why it was looking at the road. That part has always bothered me. It was not looking at me. At least, I do not think it was. The figure's head was angled down toward the pavement, as if it was focused on something that had happened there or something it could not leave behind. Maybe it had nothing to do with me at all. Maybe I was just a child who happened to look at the right place at the right moment. Maybe that is why the figure never reacted. Maybe that is why it did not move. Maybe it was not aware of me. Or maybe it was, and I simply could not tell. It is strange how a brief moment can stay with you for years. I have forgotten thousands of ordinary days from childhood. I have forgotten what I ate, what clothes I wore, what games I played, and what I worried about in school. But I remember that front yard. I remember the road in the distance. I remember standing still. I remember seeing white. I remember realizing the figure was not touching the ground. And I remember looking back after my cousin called me inside and seeing nothing at all. Even now, I cannot explain it. Maybe it was an illusion. Maybe it was a person. Maybe it was a trick of distance and light. Maybe it was a memory that became stranger over time. Or maybe for 30 seconds when I was 8 or 9 years old, I saw something standing a foot above the road that should not have been there. I do not know, but I have never forgotten it. I was about 11 years old when I saw something in my school toilets that I still cannot explain. It happened in the afternoon, around 2:45, during the final lesson of the day. The bell for home time was not supposed to ring until about 3:15, so there was still half an hour left of class. I remember that clearly, because the end of the school day always felt close at that time. Everyone was tired, restless, and watching the clock without looking obvious about it. The classroom had that late afternoon feeling to it. The teacher was still trying to finish whatever lesson we were doing, but most of us had already mentally gone home. There was probably sunlight coming through the windows, making the room brighter on one side than the other. Pencils were tapping. Chairs shifted against the floor. People whispered when they thought the teacher was not listening. Nothing about the day felt unusual, but there had been rumors going around school for months. At first, the rumors were about the boys' toilets. Someone had said they saw something in there. Then, someone else said they heard voices when nobody was inside. Another kid claimed a toilet flushed by itself. Someone said they saw a shadow in the cubicles. The stories changed every time they were repeated, the way school stories always do. One person would say it was a ghost. Another would say it was a man hiding in the toilets. Someone else would say it was a dead student, even though nobody knew of any student actually dying there. For about 2 weeks, it was all anyone seemed to talk about during break time. Kids would stand around the playground talking in low voices. Some would act brave and say they had gone in there alone. Others would dare people to use the boys' toilets during lunch. A few would say they heard screaming from inside. Some would pretend they knew exactly what happened, even though they clearly did not. At that age, rumors spread faster than facts. One kid says they saw something, and by the end of the day, half the school is convinced the building is haunted. I did not know whether I believed it. Part of me thought it was stupid. I knew kids liked to scare each other. We all watched scary movies we were probably too young to watch, told ghost stories at sleepovers, and dared each other to do things in dark hallways. The toilets were an easy place for a rumor to grow because they were separated from the classrooms, quiet during lessons, and full of locked cubicles where you could not always see if someone was inside. But another part of me did not like using them. Not because I had seen anything, not because I had heard voices or strange sounds, just because the rumors had gotten into my head. For a while, every time I went into the boys' toilets, I became aware of the silence. I would glance toward the cubicles before washing my hands. I would listen for someone moving behind a stall door. I would hurry a little more than usual when I was alone. Then, After a few weeks, the talk seemed to disappear. No one mentioned the ghost anymore. The rumors faded the way school rumors often do. Something new happened. Somebody got in trouble. A fight started. A teacher said something funny. Someone brought in a weird toy or told a different story. The boys' toilets stopped being interesting. For about 2 or 3 weeks, nobody said anything at all. Then the girls started talking. They said something weird was happening in their toilets. The girls' toilets were right next to the boys' toilets, both along the same hallway. There was not much between them. You would walk down from the classrooms, turn into the hall, and the doors were close together. At first, I only heard pieces of it. Girls whispering together at break time. Someone saying she did not want to go in there alone. Someone else saying they had seen something move by the mirror. Another girl saying she heard someone crying in one of the cubicles. The stories were not exactly the same as the boys' rumors, but they had the same feeling. Something was wrong in the bathrooms. Nobody could agree on what it was. Nobody had proof. But enough people were scared that it became a topic again. For another couple of weeks, people talked about it constantly. Then that died down too. Eventually, nobody mentioned the toilets at all. The school went back to normal. Months passed. By the time the day of my experience came, the stories were mostly forgotten. It had been around 3 months since the original rumors had started. I had not been thinking about ghosts in the toilets. I had not been scared during the school day. I had not gone into class expecting anything strange to happen. That is why it caught me so completely off guard. I was sitting in my last lesson of the day, trying to pay attention, when I realized I needed to use the toilet. I raised my hand. The teacher looked at me and asked what I needed. I said I needed to go to the toilet. He gave me permission. Nothing unusual about that. I got up from my chair, walked out of the classroom, and headed down the hallway. The school was quiet because everyone was in lessons. That kind of quiet always feels different from when school is empty after hours. During lessons, you know hundreds of people are nearby, but they are all behind closed doors. You can hear muffled voices through classroom walls, the occasional scrape of a chair, maybe a teacher talking loudly, but the hallways themselves feel still. I remember walking toward the toilets and not feeling afraid. The hallway was familiar. I had walked it countless times. The lights were on. Daylight was still coming through windows farther down the corridor. There was no reason to be worried. I reached the door to the boys' toilets and opened it. The entrance had a small wall on the right side, so you could not see the entire room immediately. You had to walk in a little farther and turn around that section of wall. Then the cubicles were along one side, while the toilet stalls were directly opposite them. It was a basic school bathroom layout. Not huge, not fancy, just tiled floors, sinks, cubicle doors, toilet stalls, and the kind of harsh overhead lighting that makes everything look slightly pale. I stepped inside. Then I turned the corner. And I stopped. I did not mean to stop. My body just did. I froze in the doorway area, staring into the open space between the cubicles and the toilet stalls. Something was there. At first, I could not understand what I was looking at. It looked like a figure, human-shaped more or less. But it was hollow. That is the best way I can describe it. It was not a person standing in the bathroom. It was not a student wearing dark clothes. It was not a teacher. It was not someone hiding behind a cubicle door. It was an outline, a shape that seemed to have the form of a person without actually being solid. There was no clear face, no clear clothing, no normal skin, hair, arms, or legs that I could identify. It looked like the space around a person had somehow been cut out of the room, like the air itself had taken the outline of a body. The edges of it were jittery. That is the part that has always been hardest to explain. The figure did not have clean lines. It was not like looking at a shadow on a wall. It was like looking at a distorted image on an old television, where the picture shakes and flickers around the edges. The outline seemed unstable, like it could not stay still even though the figure itself was not moving. It hovered there, not standing properly on the floor, not walking, not leaning against anything. It was just in the space between the cubicles and the stalls. The room around it looked normal. The tiles were normal. The cubicle doors were normal. The lights were normal. But the thing in the middle of the room did not belong there. For a few seconds, I could not move. I remember staring at it, trying to tell myself I was mistaken. Maybe it was a person standing in shadow. Maybe it was a reflection from a mirror. Maybe the light was flickering and making a normal object look strange. Maybe someone had left a jacket, bag, or cleaning equipment in an odd place. Maybe I was seeing steam, dust, or some kind of reflection. But none of those explanations worked. There was nothing in that bathroom that should have made a human-shaped hollow outline appear, and it was hovering. I did not see feet on the floor. I did not see a shadow beneath it. I did not see any clear point where it connected to the ground. It seemed suspended. The figure did not rush toward me. It did not make a sound. It did not turn its head. It did not reach out. That almost made it worse. If it had moved, maybe I would have reacted immediately and run. But because it was so still, I kept looking, trying to understand it. I must have stood there for about 15 seconds. Maybe it was less. Maybe it was longer. When you are frightened, time becomes strange. A few seconds can feel like an entire minute. Your thoughts slow down, but at the same time, your body is screaming at you to move. I remember every small detail of those seconds. The cold feeling spreading through my chest, the way my hands felt suddenly numb, the sound of the lights humming above me, the silence of the empty bathroom, the strange outline in front of me that seemed to flicker at its edges without actually moving. I tried to take one step backward, very slowly. I did not want to turn around. I did not want to take my eyes off it. I was trying to find the door behind me, reaching backward with one hand while staring at the figure. My fingers felt around for the door handle. I could not find it at first. That made me panic more. I kept stepping backward, slowly, trying not to make noise, trying not to turn away. Then I felt the door. The second I touched it, something in me broke. I pulled it open, spun around, and ran. I sprinted down the hallway back toward my classroom. I do not remember caring whether a teacher saw me running. I did not care if I looked stupid. I did not care if someone asked why I was out of class. I just needed to get away from that bathroom. The hallway that had seemed normal a few minutes earlier suddenly felt too long. I ran past classroom doors, past windows, past lockers or notice boards, whatever was along the corridor, and finally reached my classroom. When I came in, I was breathing hard. The teacher may have looked at me strangely. Other students probably noticed. But I do not remember exactly what I said. I may have told the teacher I was fine. I may have said nothing at all. I may have tried to act like I had just rushed back because I was nervous about being out of class. I did not tell anyone in the room what I saw. I did not want people to laugh. I did not want the teacher to assume I was trying to get attention. I did not want someone to say, "You were just scared because of those old rumors." And maybe I was. That thought was already in my head. Maybe the stories from months earlier had stayed somewhere in my mind and suddenly returned when I walked into an empty bathroom. Maybe my brain had created something from a shadow because I knew that people had been saying the toilets were haunted. But at that moment, I did not feel like I had imagined it. It had looked too clear, too specific, too wrong. I only told one friend. I waited until I could speak to him quietly. I do not remember whether it was during class, at break, or just after the final bell, but I told him that I had seen something in the boys' toilets. At first, I was embarrassed even saying it. I probably started by asking if he remembered the old ghost stories. Then I told him what I saw. A hollow figure, a jittering outline, hovering between the cubicles and the toilet stalls. I expected him to laugh. Maybe he did at first. That is what kids do when someone tells a scary story. They laugh because they do not know whether to believe it, and because laughing is easier than admitting something might be frightening. But he could see I was serious. I told him I was not joking. I told him I had stood there and looked at it. I told him I ran because I could not make sense of what it was. After the final bell rang, we went back together. The school day was over, but people were still moving through the hallways. Students were leaving classrooms. Teachers were packing things up. The building had the usual after-school noise, voices, bags, lockers, footsteps, people calling to friends. Having another person with me made me feel a little braver. We walked down the hallway toward the toilets. The closer we got, the more nervous I became. I kept thinking about the room. I kept picturing the figure hovering there. Part of me hoped it would be gone. Another part of me almost hoped it would still be there, because then I would know I had not imagined it. We reached the boys' toilets. My friend opened the door first, or maybe I did. I do not remember. We walked in. We turned around the wall. There was nothing there. The room was completely normal. The cubicles were empty. The stalls were empty. The lights were on. There was no flickering shape, no hollow outline, no person hiding, no strange sound, nothing. We checked around. We looked inside the stalls. We looked toward the cubicles. We stood in the exact area where I had seen the figure. There was no explanation. No object that could have created the illusion. No mirror at the right angle. No broken light. No cleaning equipment. No hanging coat. Nothing. My friend did not see anything. That should have made me feel better. Instead, it made me more confused. For a while, I wondered whether I had really seen it at all. Maybe I had been tired. Maybe the overhead lights had flickered for a second. Maybe I had seen my own reflection in something shiny and misunderstood it. Maybe a person had been in there and moved into a stall without me noticing. Maybe I had seen a shadow from outside the door. But none of those explanations really fit. I knew the room layout. I knew where the cubicles were. I knew where the stalls were. And what I saw had been standing in the open space between them. It had not looked like a shadow on the wall. It had not looked like a person walking away. It had looked like a hollow body-shaped distortion floating in the middle of the bathroom. I never saw it again. That was the only time. The old rumors did not start up again after that, at least not in a way I heard. No one came running out of the toilets screaming. No teachers made announcements. No one told a story that exactly matched mine. The bathrooms returned to being normal bathrooms. I still used them, although I was more careful about going alone for a while. Sometimes I would wait for another person to go in first. Sometimes I would leave the door open longer than usual. Sometimes I would avoid looking too closely toward the spot where I had seen the figure. But nothing else happened. As I got older, I thought about it differently. At 11, it felt like I had seen a ghost, not a person, not a shadow, not something explainable. A ghost, or some kind of presence. At 16, I thought maybe I had scared myself because of the old rumors. As an adult, I try to think of every normal explanation first. School bathrooms are full of reflective surfaces, strange lighting, shadows, and echoes. There could have been sunlight coming through a window at an odd angle. There could have been a reflection from a sink or tiled wall. Someone could have been moving in a stall, and my brain turned part of their shape into something else. Maybe I was already nervous, because I remembered the rumors even if I had not consciously been thinking about them. Maybe the human brain is simply too good at finding bodies and faces in random shapes, especially when we are alone somewhere quiet. I know all of that, but I still cannot completely explain what I saw. The figure was too distinct. It was not just a dark patch. It was not a quick flash. I stood there and looked at it. I watched the outline jitter around the edges. I watched it hover in the middle of the bathroom. Then I ran. There are things from childhood I barely remember now. I do not remember most school days. I do not remember most lessons. I do not remember what I ate for lunch or who I sat beside in class during certain years. But I remember that afternoon. I remember the time, around 2:45, the last lesson before home time. I remember raising my hand and asking to use the toilet. I remember walking down the quiet hallway. I remember opening the boys' bathroom door. Then I remember turning around that small wall and seeing something that should not have been there. A hollowed-out figure, a trembling, jittering outline, hovering silently between the cubicles and the stalls. It was the most bizarre thing I have ever seen, and even now, after all these years, I still do not know what it was. When I was around 8 years old, I was outside in my backyard on the trampoline when I looked up and saw something I have never been able to explain. It was an ordinary day at first. I do not remember the exact year, the season, or what I had been doing before I went outside. I only remember that I was young enough for the backyard to feel like its own little world. At that age, you do not need a reason to go outside. A trampoline is enough. You can spend an hour jumping, making up games, pretending the ground is dangerous, trying to bounce as high as possible, or simply staring at the sky between jumps. The backyard was familiar to me. I knew where the flowers were. I knew which parts of the grass were softer, where the fence ran, which trees or bushes were near the edges, and where the house stood behind me. It was a safe place. It was home. Nothing about it felt strange before that moment. I was jumping on the trampoline, probably alone. The trampoline had that familiar squeaking, springy sound every time I landed. The mat would dip under my feet and throw me back up. I remember the feeling of being briefly weightless at the top of each jump, then dropping back down again. When you are a kid, a trampoline can make you feel like you are almost flying. You jump high enough to see over the fence. You look at the roofline from a different angle. You feel closer to the clouds than you usually do. I may have been looking up because I was in the middle of a jump. Maybe I was catching my balance. Maybe I had simply gotten bored and started watching the sky. Then I saw it. At first, I did not understand what I was looking at. There was something huge above me. It was an eye, not a small eye like a person's eye, not the shape of a cloud that happened to resemble one. It looked like a massive blue eye opening in the sky. I remember the color most clearly. Blue, bright, deep blue, the kind of blue that stood out immediately against the rest of the sky. The eye was enormous, so large that it did not feel like it could belong to anything normal. I did not see a whole face around it. I did not see a body. I did not see anything that gave it a clear shape beyond the eye itself. It simply appeared above me. It opened. That is the detail that has stayed with me all these years. It did not just look like an eye in the sky. It looked like it opened, like something had been closed, and then the lid lifted. For a second, I froze on the trampoline. I was old enough to know that eyes do not belong in the sky, but young enough that I did not have a sensible explanation ready. My mind did not immediately think about clouds, reflections, sunlight, or imagination. I only knew that something huge was looking down. The eyeball moved. It darted to the left first. I remember watching it shift quickly, almost as if it was looking around. Then it moved downward. It looked directly at me. That was when fear hit me. The eye seemed to focus on me from above the yard. It did not feel like I was simply looking at some strange thing in the sky. It felt like the thing had noticed me, like it had turned and looked straight down. I froze for a second. I do not remember screaming. I do not remember falling. I do not remember calling for anyone. I just stood there on the trampoline, staring upward, with the sudden feeling that I had been seen by something far too big to understand. At that age, I did not have horror movies or paranormal explanations running through my mind the way I might have as an adult. I did not think about aliens. I did not think about monsters. I did not think about hallucinations or optical illusions. I thought it might be God. That was the explanation my 8-year-old brain gave me. Not because I had any proof, not because I had been told that God appeared as a giant blue eye in the sky, but because God was the biggest thing I knew of. God was someone who could see everything. God was someone who watched people. God was someone adults said knew what you did even when nobody else was there. So when I saw a huge eye looking down at me, the thought came naturally. Maybe God is checking on me. That idea did not completely make me feel better. I was still scared. The eye was too large. It was too strange. It had moved. It had looked at me. It had appeared in the sky above my backyard, where nothing like that should ever be. But once I decided it might be God, my fear changed. It became something closer to nervousness. I felt as though I needed to behave properly. I quickly got off the trampoline. I remember stepping down from it, probably still looking up from time to time, unsure whether the eye was watching me. I did not run straight inside. I did not hide. Instead, I started walking around the backyard. I tried to act like a good girl. That is how I remember it. I walked around looking at the flowers. I made sure not to pick them. I looked at plants, leaves, grass, and whatever else was in the yard. I tried to admire nature. I tried to be calm. I tried to do everything in a gentle and careful way, like I had suddenly become aware that someone important was watching. I did not want to do anything wrong. It sounds silly now, but at the time, it made perfect sense to me. If God was looking down at me, then I should be good. I should not ruin the flowers. I should not do anything mean. I should not be reckless. I should just walk around nicely and appreciate the backyard. So that is what I did. I walked around the grass and looked at things I probably would not have noticed on an ordinary day. I looked at flowers without touching them. I watched leaves move. I may have crouched down to look at bugs or small plants. I remember trying to appear calm, even though part of me was still frightened. Every few seconds, I probably wanted to look back up, but I was afraid to. There is something strange about being watched by something you do not understand. You want to know whether it is still there, but you also do not want to see it again. For a while, I kept my attention on the backyard. I tried to make myself busy. I remember the feeling of being very careful, as though I was taking some kind of test I did not understand. Then, eventually, I felt brave enough to glance up again. The eye was gone. There was only the sky. Nothing huge, nothing blue, nothing open and looking down. No cloud shaped like an eye that I could point to. No strange light. No sign that anything had been there at all. I stood there looking upward, trying to find it again. But it was gone. I do not remember feeling immediate relief. I think I was mostly confused. The experience had happened so quickly, but it felt enormous. I had seen something impossible, decided it might be God, tried to behave well for it, and then looked up again to find that the sky was normal. At 8 years old, I did not know what to do with that. I did not immediately run inside and tell my family. I did not tell my parents that a giant blue eye had opened above the trampoline and looked at me. I did not say, "I think God was staring at me." I do not know why I kept it to myself. Maybe I thought no one would believe me. Maybe I thought it was too strange to explain. Maybe I thought it was supposed to be private. Or maybe children often keep things quiet when they do not have the words to make sense of them. I just carried the memory. For years, it stayed in the back of my mind. Every once in a while, I would remember it suddenly. I would be outside looking at the sky, or I would see a blue patch between clouds, and the image would return, that enormous eye, the way it opened, the way it moved left, then down, the feeling that it had looked directly at me. I thought about whether it could have been a cloud. That is the most logical explanation. Clouds can look like almost anything, especially to children. They can resemble faces, animals, buildings, hands, eyes, and huge, strange creatures. If the sunlight hit them at the right angle, a blue opening in the sky could have looked like an iris. A darker cloud edge could have looked like an eyelid opening. The movement of clouds could have made it seem as though the eye was shifting. Maybe that is what happened. Maybe I saw a strange cloud formation and gave it meaning because I was a child. Maybe I was bouncing high enough on the trampoline that the sky seemed to move differently between jumps. Maybe sunlight reflected through thin clouds in a way that made the blue look unusually bright. Maybe my mind filled in the rest. That is possible. But the memory feels more specific than that. I do not remember seeing a cloud that looked a little like an eye. I remember seeing an eye. I remember it opening. I remember the pupil or eyeball moving. I remember it looking down at me. And even though I know memories can change over time, that central image has stayed the same. As I got older, I stopped thinking of it as God in such a simple way. When I was 8, God was the only explanation that made sense to me. I did not think it was evil. I did not feel like I was being attacked. I did not feel like something wanted to hurt me. I felt watched. And because I had been taught that God watches people, I connected the two things. But as an adult, I can understand that my childhood interpretation may have come from fear, imagination, faith, or all three mixed together. Maybe I had seen something natural, and my mind had made it spiritual. Maybe I had experienced a vivid moment that became stronger in memory every time I thought about it. Maybe there was a perfectly ordinary explanation I never understood. Or maybe I saw something that I will never be able to explain. I waited until I was in my 30s to tell my family. That took a long time. For decades, the story stayed mostly inside my head. I would think about it sometimes, but I did not bring it up much. It felt too weird. Even as an adult, telling someone when I was 8, I saw a giant blue eye open in the sky and look at me, sounds like the kind of thing people would immediately dismiss. So I kept it quiet. Then, at some point in my 30s, I finally told my family. I do not remember exactly what started the conversation. Maybe people were sharing strange childhood memories. Maybe someone brought up religion, dreams, ghosts, or unusual things they had seen. Maybe I just reached a point where I thought, why not tell them? I expected surprise. I expected questions. Maybe I hoped someone would remember that day and say the sky had looked strange. Maybe I hoped a sibling had seen something too. Maybe I hoped someone would say, you used to talk about that when you were little, and prove that the memory had not changed over time. Instead, they did not believe me. That did not surprise me as much as it probably should have. A giant eye in the sky is not an easy thing to believe. My family may have thought I had imagined it. They may have assumed I saw clouds and turned it into a story. They may have thought I was remembering a dream. They may have laughed because it sounded so strange. But I remember it vividly. I remember being on the trampoline. I remember the feeling of air under my feet as I bounced. I remember looking up. I remember the blue. I remember freezing. I remember deciding it must be God and trying very hard to behave like a good girl in the backyard. That part is almost funny to me now. There I was, scared by something impossible, walking around the yard carefully and looking at flowers without picking them, because I thought a giant eye in the sky might be checking whether I behaved. But it also feels sad in a way. I was a child trying to make sense of something enormous. I did not have anyone to ask. I did not know whether I should be scared. I did not know whether I had done something wrong. I only knew that I felt watched, and I wanted to be good. I sometimes wonder whether children are more willing to accept strange things because they have not yet learned how quickly adults explain them away. An adult sees a strange cloud and says, "That is an optical illusion." A child sees a giant blue eye in the sky and thinks, "God is looking at me." Neither response is necessarily wrong. One tries to understand the world through logic. The other tries to understand it through meaning. Maybe both are ways of dealing with something we cannot fully explain. I still do not know what I saw. I do not know whether it was a cloud formation, a trick of sunlight, an afterimage, or something created by being on a trampoline and staring up at a bright sky. I do not know whether fear made the eye seem bigger than it was. I do not know whether the movement I remember was really the clouds shifting. I do not know whether I ever truly saw an eye at all. But I know how real it felt. I know I saw something open. I know it was blue. I know it darted left, then looked down. And I know that when it did, I felt completely small beneath it. The backyard, which had felt safe a moment earlier, suddenly felt exposed. The trampoline, which had made me feel like I was flying, became the place where something in the sky noticed me. The flowers, grass, and fence all became part of a strange little world where I was trying to prove I was good to something I could not understand. Then it was gone. The sky returned to normal. The backyard returned to normal. And I was left with a memory that nobody else seemed to share. Even now I can picture it. The bright blue eye opening above me, the huge shape against the sky, the movement of it looking around, then the moment it looked down at me. I do not know what it was, but I have never forgotten it. When I was around 8 years old, I was outside in my backyard on the trampoline when I looked up and saw something I have never been able to explain. It was an ordinary day at first. I do not remember the exact year, the season, or what I had been doing before I went outside. I only remember that I was young enough for the backyard to feel like its own little world. At that age, you do not need a reason to go outside. A trampoline is enough. You can spend an hour jumping, making up games, pretending the ground is dangerous, trying to bounce as high as possible, or simply staring at the sky between jumps. The backyard was familiar to me. I knew where the flowers were. I knew which parts of the grass were softer, where the fence ran, which trees or bushes were near the edges, and where the house stood behind me. It was a safe place. It was home. Nothing about it felt strange before that moment. I was jumping on the trampoline, probably alone. The trampoline had that familiar squeaking springy sound every time I landed. The mat would dip under my feet and throw me back up. I remember the feeling of being briefly weightless at the top of each jump, then dropping back down again. When you are a kid, a trampoline can make you feel like you are almost flying. You jump high enough to see over the fence. You look at the roofline from a different angle. You feel closer to the clouds than you usually do. I may have been looking up because I was in the middle of a jump. Maybe I was catching my balance. Maybe I had simply gotten bored and started watching the sky. Then I saw it. At first, I did not understand what I was looking at. There was something huge above me. It was an eye. Not a small eye like a person's eye. Not the shape of a cloud that happened to resemble one. It looked like a massive blue eye opening in the sky. I remember the color most clearly. Blue. Bright, deep blue. The kind of blue that stood out immediately against the rest of the sky. The eye was enormous, so large that it did not feel like it could belong to anything normal. I did not see a whole face around it. I did not see a body. I did not see anything that gave it a clear shape beyond the eye itself. It simply appeared above me. It opened. That is the detail that has stayed with me all these years. It did not just look like an eye in the sky. It looked like it opened, like something had been closed, and then the lid lifted. For a second, I froze on the trampoline. I was old enough to know that eyes do not belong in the sky, but young enough that I did not have a sensible explanation ready. My mind did not immediately think about clouds, reflections, sunlight, or imagination. I only knew that something huge was looking down. The eyeball moved. It darted to the left first. I remember watching it shift quickly, almost as if it was looking around. Then it moved downward. It looked directly at me. That was when fear hit me. The eye seemed to focus on me from above the yard. It did not feel like I was simply looking at some strange thing in the sky. It felt like the thing had noticed me, like it had turned and looked straight down. I froze for a second. I do not remember screaming. I do not remember falling. I do not remember calling for anyone. I just stood there on the trampoline, staring upward, with the sudden feeling that I had been seen by something far too big to understand. At that age, I did not have horror movies or paranormal explanations running through my mind the way I might have as an adult. I did not think about aliens. I did not think about monsters. I did not think about hallucinations or optical illusions. I thought it might be God. That was the explanation my 8-year-old brain gave me. Not because I had any proof, not because I had been told that God appeared as a giant blue eye in the sky, but because God was the biggest thing I knew of. God was someone who could see everything. God was someone who watched people. God was someone adults said knew what you did, even when nobody else was there. So when I saw a huge eye looking down at me, the thought came naturally. Maybe God is checking on me. That idea did not completely make me feel better. I was still scared. The eye was too large. It was too strange. It had moved. It had looked at me. It had appeared in the sky above my backyard, where nothing like that should ever be. But once I decided it might be God, my fear changed. It became something closer to nervousness. I felt as though I needed to behave properly. I quickly got off the trampoline. I remember stepping down from it, probably still looking up from time to time, unsure whether the eye was watching me. I did not run straight inside. I did not hide. Instead, I started walking around the backyard. I tried to act like a good girl. That is how I remember it. I walked around, looking at the flowers. I made sure not to pick them. I looked at plants, leaves, grass, and whatever else was in the yard. I tried to admire nature. I tried to be calm. I tried to do everything in a gentle and careful way, like I had suddenly become aware that someone important was watching. I did not want to do anything wrong. It sounds silly now, but at the time, it made perfect sense to me. If God was looking down at me, then I should be good. I should not ruin the flowers. I should not do anything mean. I should not be reckless. I should just walk around nicely and appreciate the backyard. So that is what I did. I walked around the grass and looked at things I probably would not have noticed on an ordinary day. I looked at flowers without touching them. I watched leaves move. I may have crouched down to look at bugs or small plants. I remember trying to appear calm, even though part of me was still frightened. Every few seconds I probably wanted to look back up, but I was afraid to. There is something strange about being watched by something you do not understand. You want to know whether it is still there, but you also do not want to see it again. For a while I kept my attention on the backyard. I tried to make myself busy. I remember the feeling of being very careful, as though I was taking some kind of test I did not understand. Then, eventually, I felt brave enough to glance up again. The eye was gone. There was only this, nothing huge, nothing blue, nothing open and looking down, no cloud shaped like an eye that I could point to, no strange light, no sign that anything had been there at all. I stood there looking upward, trying to find it again, but it was gone. I do not remember feeling immediate relief. I think I was mostly confused. The experience had happened so quickly, but it felt enormous. I had seen something impossible, decided it might be God, tried to behave well for it, and then looked up again to find that the sky was normal. At 8 years old, I did not know what to do with that. I did not immediately run inside and tell my family. I did not tell my parents that a giant blue eye had opened above the trampoline and looked at me. I did not say, I think God was staring at me. I do not know why I kept it to myself. Maybe I thought no one would believe me. Maybe I thought it was too strange to explain. Maybe I thought it was supposed to be private. Or maybe children often keep things quiet when they do not have the words to make sense of them. I just carried the memory. For years it stayed in the back of my mind. Every once in a while, I would remember it suddenly. I would be outside looking at the sky, or I would see a blue patch between clouds, and the image would return. That enormous eye, the way it opened, the way it moved left, then down, the feeling that it had looked directly at me. I thought about whether it could have been a cloud. That is the most logical explanation. Clouds can look like almost anything, especially to children. They can resemble faces, animals, buildings, hands, eyes, and huge strange creatures. If the sunlight hit them at the right angle, a blue opening in the sky could have looked like an iris. A darker cloud edge could have looked like an eyelid opening. The movement of clouds could have made it seem as though the eye was shifting. Maybe that is what happened. Maybe I saw a strange cloud formation and gave it meaning because I was a child. Maybe I was bouncing high enough on the trampoline that the sky seemed to move differently between jumps. Maybe sunlight reflected through thin clouds in a way that made the blue look unusually bright. Maybe my mind filled in the rest. That is possible. But the memory feels more specific than that. I do not remember seeing a cloud that looked a little like an eye. I remember seeing an eye. I remember it opening. I remember the pupil or eyeball moving. I remember it looking down at me. And even though I know memories can change over time, that central image has stayed the same. As I got older, I stopped thinking of it as God in such a simple way. When I was 8, God was the only explanation that made sense to me. I did not think it was evil. I did not feel like I was being attacked. I did not feel like something wanted to hurt me. I felt watched. And because I had been taught that God watches people, I connected the two things. But as an adult, I can understand that my childhood interpretation may have come from fear, imagination, faith, or all three mixed together. Maybe I had seen something natural, and my mind had made it spiritual. Maybe I had experienced a vivid moment that became stronger in memory every time I thought about it. Maybe there was a perfectly ordinary explanation I never understood. Or maybe I saw something that I will never be able to explain. I waited until I was in my 30s to tell my family. That took a long time. For decades, the story stayed mostly inside my head. I would think about it sometimes, but I did not bring it up much. It felt too weird. Even as an adult, telling someone when I was 8, I saw a giant blue eye open in the sky and look at me. Sounds like the kind of thing people would immediately dismiss. So I kept it quiet. Then, at some point in my 30s, I finally told my family. I do not remember exactly what started the conversation. Maybe people were sharing strange childhood memories. Maybe someone brought up religion, dreams, ghosts, or unusual things they had seen. Maybe I just reached a point where I thought, why not tell them? I expected surprise. I expected questions. Maybe I hoped someone would remember that day and say the sky had looked strange. Maybe I hoped a sibling had seen something too. Maybe I hoped someone would say, you used to talk about that when you were little, and prove that the memory had not changed over time. Instead, they did not believe me. That did not surprise me as much as it probably should have. A giant eye in the sky is not an easy thing to believe. My family may have thought I had imagined it. They may have assumed I saw clouds and turned it into a story. They may have thought I was remembering a dream. They may have laughed because it sounded so strange. But I remember it vividly. I remember being on the trampoline. I remember the feeling of air under my feet as I bounced. I remember looking up. I remember the blue. I remember freezing. I remember deciding it must be God and trying very hard to behave like a good girl in the backyard. That part is almost funny to me now. There I was, scared by something impossible, walking around the yard carefully and looking at flowers without picking them because I thought a giant eye in the sky might be checking whether I behaved. But it also feels sad in a way. I was a child trying to make sense of something enormous. I did not have anyone to ask. I did not know whether I should be scared. I did not know whether I had done something wrong. I only knew that I felt watched, and I wanted to be good. I sometimes wonder whether children are more willing to accept strange things because they have not yet learned how quickly adults explain them away. An adult sees a strange cloud and says, that is an optical illusion. A child sees a giant blue eye in the sky and thinks, God is looking at me. Neither response is necessarily wrong. One tries to understand the world through logic. The other tries to understand it through meaning. Maybe both are ways of dealing with something we cannot fully explain. I still do not know what I saw. I do not know whether it was a cloud formation, a trick of sunlight, an afterimage, or something created by being on a trampoline and staring up at a bright sky. I do not know whether fear made the eye seem bigger than it was. I do not know whether the movement I remember was really the clouds shifting. I do not know whether I ever truly saw an eye at all. But I know how real it felt. I know I saw something open. I know it was blue. I know it darted left, then looked down. And I know that when it did, I felt completely small beneath it. The backyard, which had felt safe a moment earlier, suddenly felt exposed. The trampoline, which had made me feel like I was flying, became the place where something in the sky noticed me. The flowers, grass, and fence all became part of a strange little world where I was trying to prove I was good to something I could not understand. Then it was gone. The sky returned to normal. The backyard returned to normal. And I was left with a memory that nobody else seemed to share. Even now I can picture it. The bright blue eye opening above me, the huge shape against the sky, the movement of it looking around. Then the moment it looked down at me. I do not know what it was, but I have never forgotten it. Years ago, I was in bed sleeping when I woke up to something loud playing somewhere in the house. At first, I did not understand what I was hearing. It sounded almost like there was a concert happening far away, not close enough that I could make out a song clearly, Not close enough that I could hear individual words, but loud enough that I could tell there was music, voices, and the kind of sound you get when a lot of noise is coming from speakers. It had that distant, muffled quality, like standing outside a stadium or hearing a party from several houses away. For a few seconds, I stayed in bed and listened. I remember being confused more than scared at first. I was still half asleep, trying to figure out whether the sound was part of a dream or something actually happening around me. Sometimes when you wake up suddenly in the middle of the night, your brain takes a minute to catch up. The room feels unfamiliar even though you have slept in it 100 times. The darkness seems too thick. Normal noises sound strange, but this was not a normal sound. It was too loud. It was not the house settling. It was not wind. It was not a car passing by outside. It was not a neighbor's television barely coming through a wall. It sounded like music or some kind of event was happening somewhere below me. My bedroom was on the main floor of the house. The basement was directly underneath, and the house had those old heating things that pushed hot air through vents. I cannot remember the proper name for them now. They looked old, and when they were running, you could sometimes hear air moving through them or feel warmth coming out. At first, I thought maybe the sound was somehow coming through one of those heating vents. That seemed possible. Houses can carry sound in weird ways. A television playing downstairs can sound much farther away than it actually is, especially if the sound travels through vents, pipes, or hollow spaces in the walls. Sometimes you hear something from another room and cannot tell where it is coming from, because the house changes the way the sound moves. So, I got out of bed. I remember walking quietly across my room in the dark. I was tired, confused, and not fully thinking about what I was doing. I only wanted to find out where the noise was coming from, so I could turn it off or tell someone. I crouched down near the old heating vent. The sound was stronger there. That was when I realized it was coming from the basement. I remember leaning closer, almost putting my ear near the vent, trying to hear whether it was music, television, people talking, or something else. It was hard to make out exactly. It really did sound like some kind of concert happening in the distance. There was a low rumble of sound, then louder music, then what might have been cheering, talking, or a crowd. It was strange because nobody should have been down there. Everyone was supposed to be asleep. The house was quiet except for that noise. I looked at the clock. It was 3:30 in the morning. That time means more to me now than it did then. At the time, I only remember thinking that it was really late or really early, depending on how you looked at it. I remember feeling annoyed and confused. Why would the television be on downstairs at 3:30 a.m.? Why would it be loud enough to wake me up through the floor? I knew we had a television in the basement. It was not unusual for people to use it during the day. Maybe someone would watch movies down there. Maybe we played games or used the basement as a second living room. But nobody ever watched it at that volume. Not even close. The sound was way too loud. It was loud enough that I had woken up from sleep on the main floor. It had traveled through the basement ceiling, through the floor beneath my room, through the old heating system, and into my bedroom. It was not a little bit of sound leaking upward. It was blasting. I stood there for a minute, debating whether I should wake someone up. Part of me thought I should tell my parents or my sister. But I was also tired, and I thought maybe it would be easier to go downstairs, turn off the television, and get back to bed. That sounds stupid now. But when you are half asleep, you do not always make decisions based on what is safest. You make decisions based on what is quickest. I wanted the sound to stop. So I went toward the basement door. The hallway outside my room was dark. The house had that nighttime stillness where every small movement feels louder. I could hear the floor beneath my feet. I could hear my own breathing. I could hear the muffled noise coming from below. The basement door was closed. I stood there for a second with my hand on the handle. Even before I opened it, I had the uneasy feeling that something was wrong. I did not know why. Nothing had happened yet beyond the television being too loud. Maybe someone had accidentally left it on. Maybe it had turned on because of some timer setting. Maybe a remote button had been pressed by something sitting on it. Maybe someone else in the house had gotten up and gone downstairs without telling anyone. All of those were reasonable explanations. Still, I hesitated. Then I opened the door. The noise became much clearer immediately. It was definitely the television. The volume was at maximum. I could hear it echoing up from the basement, filling the stairs and bouncing off the walls. It was not just loud in the way someone watches a movie with the volume up a little too high. It was so loud that it sounded unreal, almost distorted. The sound was booming through the basement. I started down the stairs. The basement stairs always felt different at night. During the day, they were just stairs. You could see where you were going. The basement had its own normal look. Furniture, the television, storage things, maybe laundry equipment, whatever else was down there. But at 3:30 in the morning, with the television blaring from below, the stairs felt like they led somewhere completely unfamiliar. I remember each step feeling too loud beneath my feet. The music or whatever was playing on the television filled the air. I could not hear anything else. I could not hear if someone was moving around down there. I could not hear if there was another sound hidden behind the television noise. That was what made me uncomfortable. When something is loud enough, it covers other things. If someone had been standing in the basement, I might not have heard them. If something had moved behind me, I might not have noticed. I kept going. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw the television. It was on. The screen was bright in the dark basement. I do not remember exactly what was playing. Maybe it was a music channel. Maybe it was a concert recording. Maybe it was an advertisement, a program, or something that had a lot of sound and lights. The details of what was on the screen have faded over time. What I remember is the volume. It was at max volume. We never had it that loud. Not during the day. Not for movies. Not for sports. Not for parties. Never. It made no sense. The remote was probably nearby. The television itself was glowing against the dark room, and for a few seconds, I just stood there looking at it. The basement seemed empty. I did not see anyone sitting on the couch. I did not see a family member standing near the television. I did not see anyone moving in the shadows. There was just the loud screen, the furniture, and the rest of the basement swallowed in darkness beyond the reach of the television light. I walked over and turned it off. The second I did, the basement went silent. Not quiet, silent. The difference was immediate. 1 second, the whole room was filled with music and distant crowd noise. The next second, there was nothing. The television screen went black, the basement was dark, and all the sound disappeared at once. That was when the feeling hit me. It was not a sound. It was not something I saw. It was a feeling, a deep, cold sense that I needed to get out of there. Immediately, I remember standing in the dark basement after turning off the television, and suddenly becoming aware of every part of the room around me. The couch, the corners, the stairway behind me, the spaces where the television light had been a moment before. It felt like the darkness had changed. That may sound strange. Darkness is darkness. But when the screen was on, there had been light and noise. There was something to focus on. Once I turned it off, there was nothing except the feeling that I was not supposed to be standing there. My body reacted before my mind did. I did not stop to inspect the room. I did not turn on another light. I did not check whether a door or window was open. I did not look behind the couch. I did not call out to see if someone was there. I just wanted to leave. I spun around and ran toward the stairs. The moment I started moving, I had that feeling people talk about when they are running up basement stairs in the dark. The feeling that something is behind you. Not necessarily something you can hear, not necessarily something you can see, just the absolute certainty that if you do not get up the stairs fast enough, something is going to grab you. I have felt nervous on dark stairs before. Everybody has. You turn off a basement light and walk up quickly because you do not like having your back to a dark room. But this was stronger than that. I felt like something was running after me. I did not hear footsteps clearly. I did not hear breathing. I did not hear the television come back on. But I could feel something behind me. Every step up the stairs felt like it was taking too long. I remember grabbing at the railing, moving as fast as I could, and trying not to look back. I knew that if I turned around, I might see something, and I did not want to. I reached the top of the stairs, slammed the basement door shut, and stood there for a moment, breathing hard. The house was quiet again. The main floor looked normal. The hallway was dark, but it was familiar. My bedroom was close by. My sister's room was next to mine. Everyone was asleep. Nothing had changed. But I did not feel normal. I remember going back to my room and lying down, but I do not remember falling asleep easily after that. How could I? Every small sound in the house suddenly seemed important. The heating system made its usual noises. The floor creaked somewhere. A pipe may have clicked. The wind might have moved against the outside of the house. All of it made me listen harder. I kept wondering whether the television would come back on. I kept wondering whether I would hear the concert-like noise through the heating vent again. I kept wondering whether I should wake someone up and tell them what happened. But I did not. Maybe I thought it would sound stupid. Maybe I thought everyone would say I dreamed it. Maybe I was too tired to explain it. Maybe I did not want to hear anyone say there was a normal reason for it, because a normal reason would not explain the fear I felt when the television turned off. Eventually, morning came. Daylight has a way of making nighttime experiences feel less real. The house looked completely normal in the morning. The basement door was just a door. The heating vent was just an old heating vent. The television was off. The rooms were bright enough that all the corners and shadows lost their power. But I still remembered what happened. I asked my sister if she had heard the television that night. Her room was right next to mine. If I heard it through the floor and through the heating vent, she should have heard it too. The television had been so loud that it sounded like a concert happening somewhere nearby. It was not a little hum. It was not a faint murmur of sound. It was blasting. I expected her to say yes. Maybe she would complain that it woke her up. Maybe she would ask why I had gone downstairs. Maybe she would tell me she thought someone was watching television. Instead, she said no. She had not heard anything. That shocked me. I asked again because I thought maybe she had misunderstood me. I asked if she heard the television in the basement, loud in the middle of the night. She said no. She had slept through it. Or she had not heard it at all. I could not understand how that was possible. Her room was next to mine. The sound had been loud enough to wake me up. It had sounded like a distant concert. I had crouched near the heating vent and clearly heard it coming from below. I had walked down the basement stairs and found the television on at full volume. How could she not hear it? For a long time, that was the detail that bothered me most. The television turning on by itself was strange, but electronics can act weird. Maybe the remote was faulty. Maybe there was some kind of timer. Maybe someone accidentally bumped the volume before going to bed. Maybe the television had a setting that made it turn on after a power flicker. I could think of possibilities, but the fact that nobody else heard it made the whole thing harder to explain. I wondered whether I had dreamed the sound. Maybe I woke up from a dream about a concert and thought it was coming through the vent. Maybe I was half asleep when I went downstairs. Maybe I had sleepwalked. Maybe I imagined the television being at full volume. But the memory is too physical. I remember crouching by the heating vent. I remember the cold floor beneath my feet. I remember opening the basement door and hearing the sound get louder. I remember walking down the stairs. I remember the brightness of the television in the dark basement. I remember turning it off, and more than anything, I remember the silence afterward. The television going silent did not feel like the end of a weird technical problem. It felt like the beginning of something worse. That sudden silence gave me the strongest instinct to run that I have ever felt. I still think about the sound sometimes. It really did resemble a concert in the distance. It was loud, but slightly muffled, as though the basement was full of music and crowd noise. I did not recognize the song. I could not make out the people on the television. I could not tell whether it was a real concert, a movie scene, or something else. I only knew it was not something we normally watched, and it was never played that loudly. The strange thing is that if I had not gone downstairs, I might have convinced myself it was a dream. If I had heard the sound from my bed and then eventually fallen asleep again, I could have told myself it came from outside. I could have blamed a neighbor, a car, a distant party, or a weird dream. But I went down there. I saw the television. I turned it off. That is why it has stayed with me. I have tried to give it a logical explanation over the years. Maybe the television had a malfunction. Old televisions can turn on because of a power issue. Sometimes remotes interfere with each other. A button can get stuck. A scheduled program can start. A glitch can send the volume all the way up. Maybe a neighbor's remote somehow affected ours. Maybe someone in my family had gone downstairs earlier, watched something, turned the screen off but not fully off, and left the volume high without realizing it. Maybe the sound traveled through the heating vents in such a strange direction that it was louder in my bedroom than in my sister's. That last explanation seems unlikely, but houses can carry sound in strange ways. Maybe my room was directly above a vent or a specific part of the basement where the sound echoed. Maybe the old heating system acted like a speaker channel, sending the noise straight into my room while muffling it elsewhere. That could explain why I heard it and she did not, but it does not explain why I felt so terrified after I turned it off. Maybe that fear was simply because I was awake at 3:30 in the morning, alone in a dark basement, after being startled out of sleep by blaring television noise. That is probably the most reasonable explanation. I was tired. I was confused. The sudden silence made my imagination run wild. My body went into panic mode, and the old basement stairs became the perfect place for that fear to take over. Maybe there was never anything behind me. Maybe the feeling of being chased was only my brain reacting to the darkness. But it felt real. That is the problem with experiences like that. Even when you can explain the individual pieces, the feeling remains. The sound, the empty basement, the maximum volume, the television screen going black, the sudden urge to run, the feeling that something was right behind me as I climbed the stairs. And then, the next morning, finding out that the person sleeping in the room beside mine had heard nothing at all. I have never had another night exactly like that. I have heard televisions turn on in houses. I have heard old heating systems make strange sounds. I have felt nervous in basements. I have rushed up dark stairs because I did not want to look behind me. But I have never again been woken by something that sounded like a distant concert playing through the house at 3:30 in the morning. And I have never again found a television in the basement blasting at a volume nobody in my family would ever use. Sometimes I still wonder if there was a simple explanation I never found. Maybe there was a timer. Maybe there was a power surge. Maybe the remote malfunctioned. Maybe sound traveled through the old heat vents in a way that made no sense. Maybe my sister was sleeping deeply enough that she simply did not hear it. All of those are possible, but none of them makes the memory feel less strange. I can still picture the basement stairs. I can still remember the sound filling the darkness below me. I can still remember reaching the bottom and seeing the television screen glowing. Then, I can remember the exact moment I turned it off. The room went dark. The music stopped, and something in me knew I had to get out. I never looked back as I ran up those stairs, and I still do not know what I would have seen if I had.